There have been several powerful explosions near Kiev as residents of the Ukrainian capital have hunkered down for another night. Multiple reports say one explosion was caused by a missile attack on an oil depot southwest of the city. The fire can be seen glowing in the night sky. The UN Refugee Agency says the Russian invasion has driven more than 150,000 people to flee Ukraine to neighbouring countries further west. The vast majority have gone to Poland, many to join friends and family. Others have gone to countries including Hungary, Moldova, Romania and Slovakia. A Western coalition, including the US, the European Union, Canada and the UK, is to cut off some Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank payment system. The EU Commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, said the aim was to cripple President Vladimir Putin's ability to finance his war machine.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his government's delegation will hold talks with Russia without any conditions. The meeting is likely to take place in Belarus's southeast region of Gomel. Zelensky said in a video message on Sunday that he was skeptical of the results of the meeting, but said he should try so that citizens of Ukraine would have no doubt that he tried to stop the war. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba also stressed that no preconditions were set for the talks. He said the country is sending its delegates to listen to what their Russian counterparts want to say.
If the outcome of these talks will be peace and the end of war, that should be welcomed. But we will not, again, and I want to make it very clear, we will not surrender. We will not capitulate. We will not give up a single inch of our territory.
Meanwhile, Russian presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Moscow had sent a delegation to Belarus. The top delegate said Russia is ready for negotiations for peace anytime. The move comes as Russian troops continue to advance toward the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv and other major cities. They are said to be facing fierce counterattacks from Ukrainian forces. Media outlets report that an apartment building was attacked in Bucha, about 20 kilometers northwest of central Kyiv. The reports also say Russian tanks have entered the town where sporadic shooting is taking place. The Ukrainian Interior Ministry shared footage of a Russian military convoy entering Kharkiv and what it described as the destroyed vehicles of troops who have surrendered. The governor of the province, that includes Kharkiv, posted a message on Facebook urging residents to remain in shelters. Russian President Putin has issued orders to introduce what he's calling a special combat service regime to bolster the military's deterrence force. He gave the directive on Sunday to Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces, General Valery Gerasimov. He's believed to have given the order with nuclear deterrence in mind. Putin said NATO's leading countries have been making aggressive statements against Russia. Putin is also believed to be trying to keep Western nations in check. Putin's decision is seen as a response to Western countries ready to impose one of the toughest financial sanctions on Russia. Use of the SWIFT global payment system will be banned for some Russian banks. The U.S., France, Canada, Italy, Germany, Britain, and the European Commission announced new economic sanctions on Saturday. They did not name the banks that will be involved, but said the measure will take effect in a matter of days. SWIFT, or the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a global system that makes cross-border payments fast and secure. Western allies say the ban will weaken the ability of the selected Russian banks to operate globally. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio says Japan will join the move in response to requests from the U.S. and European nations.
It is high time to unite and take resolute action to protect the foundation of the international order.
Kishida said Japan will impose sanctions, including asset freezes, on President Vladimir Putin and other Russian government officials. He also said Japan will provide $100 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Ukraine. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki released a statement welcoming Kishida's announcement. A Japanese economist shared his views on the decision by Western allies to block selected Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system. Kyuichi Takahide says this sanction is likely to have a severe impact on the ruble.
The decision will significantly reduce trust in the Russian currency. The ruble will plunge. That will reduce trading in the ruble. People in Russia will have to pay more for imported goods, and the decision will have a damaging impact. I think the Western allies aim to sway public opinion in Russia against the war.
Kyuichi says the allies understand that there's likely to be a boomerang effect, and he says Japan won't be immune to it.
The biggest impact for Japan is that crude oil prices will rise. When oil prices rise, stock prices tend to fall in consideration of the negative impact on the economy. And when financial markets are thrown into confusion globally, investors tend to buy the yen to avoid risk. I think we will face three moves at the same time: higher oil prices, volatile movements of the Japanese currency, and falling stock prices in Tokyo.
A Ukrainian member of parliament has told NHK World that people in Kyiv are trying to take part in the resistance against the Russian forces in any way possible.
Because this is my city, we're not giving it to Russians, and we don't have anywhere to surrender.
Lawmaker Ina Sofsun now has a gun for the first time in her life. She says weapons were provided to all members of parliament after the first attack. Now she's ready to defend herself and the capital. Her 61-year-old father is also going to help defend the country, even though he has trouble with his knees. He said at least he could crawl. Sofsun appreciates the decision by Western countries to cut Russia from the SWIFT global payment system, but says further steps are needed.
Unfortunately, it is happening slightly later, but it is happening now. It will affect the Russian economy, but that is not enough. The thing that we are asking most of all right now is full trade embargo.
Sofsun stresses that if other countries continue to trade with Russia, the money will be used to buy weapons to kill Ukrainians. And she warns the world that the invasion is not just between two countries.
Please remember that this is not only the war between Ukraine and Russia. This is actually Russia's war against the whole civilized world. They're just defying the basic principles of international law and simple human decency with what they're doing now. And if they're not stopped here in Ukraine, that will mean that they will proceed further.
Ukrainians are putting up strong resistance across the country. Their struggle continues to stop Russia's attempt to change the status quo by force. Turning to the coronavirus situation here in Japan, more than 60,000 new cases were reported across the country on Sunday. In Tokyo, 10,321 new infections have been confirmed. That's down about 2,600 from a week ago. 75 people are in serious condition, up 2 from Saturday. Tokyo officials have also confirmed 28 deaths. It was a long-awaited back-to-school Saturday for many people in Afghanistan. All the country's public universities were open for the first time since the Taliban retook power last August. And the Islamist leaders are allowing women to study, though not without conditions. Female students walked onto the campus of this university in Kabul as members of the Taliban stood guard. Saturday's lessons were strictly segregated. The Taliban's interpretation of Islamic teaching forbids mixed education. The male students would turn up a full 9.5 hours later. After the takeover, the Taliban closed public universities and banned female students from secondary schools. But it has faced growing international pressure to allow women's education.
I'm so excited that once again we are able to go to universities and take classes. It's a very happy moment for us.
The first signs of change came last month when 8 universities reopened. The other 31 followed on Saturday. The Taliban says girls will be allowed back into secondary schools from late March. Here's the weather forecast for the next 3 days.
2月28日月曜日朝7時。おはようございます。三宅民夫です。
久保田明菜です。
三橋大樹です。
NHK 今朝のニュース、最新の動きを詳しくお伝えしていきます。はじめに、ロシアによるウクライナへの軍事侵攻です。ウクライナ軍が第2の都市ハリコフなど各地で抵抗を続け、戦闘は一層激しさを増しているものとみられます。こうした中、軍事侵攻が始まってから初めて、ロシアとウクライナの代表団の会談が行われることになりました。停戦につながる交渉が行われるかが焦点です。
ロシア軍とウクライナ軍との激しい戦闘が伝えられているハリコフについて、地元の州知事は27日、自身のフェイスブックに、完全に私たちがコントロールしているなどと投稿し、ロシア軍を退けたと主張しています。現地で撮影されたとみられる映像には、ロシア軍の軍用車両などが放置されている様子が映っています。ハリコフに留まっているウクライナ人の男性に話を聞くことができました。ボリス・モロズさん36歳は、現地で日本語学校を経営し、およそ30人に日本語を教えています。
今もう4日間それは続いています。今は一番ひどい爆撃だと思います。ウクライナ軍関係のところだけ爆撃すると述べていますが、現実は絶対そんなことはないです。とてもひどいです。どこにこのミサイルを当てるのは誰もわからない。
また、ハリコフでの生活については、街中でパンが無料で配られていて、長い行列ができているとした上で、ガスと電気は時々止まりますが、修理してくれる人も街に残っています。食べ物はまだ残っていますが、少なくなっていますと話していました。ロシア国防省は27日、ウクライナ軍のミサイルなど、これまでに1067の標的を破壊したと発表したほか、ロイター通信はウクライナの保健省の情報として、これまでに14人の子供を含む352人が死亡したと伝え、各地で戦闘は一層激しさを増しているものとみられます。
軍事侵攻が続く中、EU ヨーロッパ連合は緊急の内相会議を開き、ウクライナから域内に避難してきた人がすでに30万人を超えたとして、受け入れ体制を強化することを確認しました。一方、ウクライナのゼレンスキー大統領は27日、ウクライナの代表団がロシアの代表団と会談することで合意したと明らかにしました。会談はベラルーシ南東部のゴメリ州で開かれるとみられ、ゼレンスキー大統領は前提条件なしで行われるとした上で、この会談で結果が出るとは思わないが交渉してみよう。わずかでも戦争を止めるチャンスがあったのに何もしなかったということがないように、などと述べました。一方、ロシア側の交渉団トップを務めるメジンスキー大統領補佐官は27日、我々はいつでも和平交渉に応じる用意があると述べました。
ロシアによる軍事侵攻が始まってから、ロシアとウクライナの会談が行われるのは初めてで、ウクライナ各地で激しい戦闘が続く中、停戦につながる交渉が行われるかが焦点です。続いて日本政府の対応です。ウクライナ情勢をめぐり、岸田総理大臣は昨夜、ロシアによる軍事侵攻を侵略だと明言し、強く非難しました。
我が国として、断固として行動してまいります。暴挙には高い代償を伴うことを示してまいります。国際社会はロシアの侵略により、ロシアとの関係をこれまで通りにしていくことはもはやできないと。
その上で岸田総理大臣は、ロシアのプーチン大統領を含む ロシア政府関係者らの資産凍結を決定したほか、SWIFT と呼ばれる国際的な決済ネットワークからロシアの特定の銀行を締め出す措置に日本も加わることを明らかにしました。一国の首脳に対する資産凍結は異例の措置で、政府関係者は今回の対応で日露関係に影響が出るのは間違いなく、覚悟を決めて決断した。今後、アジアで同様の事態が起きた際、欧米に支援してもらうためにも踏み切らざるを得なかったと述べました。
林外務大臣は、オンライン形式で開かれた G7 主要7カ国の外相による緊急会合で、こうした日本の方針を伝えました。
各国からは日本に対して強い歓迎の意が示されました。また緊急会合では、ロシアによる軍事侵攻を侵略という表現で改めて強く非難し、制裁を含めた今後の対応などで引き続き緊密に連携していくことで一致しました。さらにおよそ2時間の会合後半には、ウクライナのクレバ外相も参加し、国際社会の支援に謝意を示した上で、現地の情勢などを説明したのに対し、G7 各国は、ウクライナの主権と領土の一体性に対する確固たる支持とともに、ウクライナ政府や国民と連帯していることを改めて伝えました。一方、アメリカなどがすべての国連加盟国が参加できる国連総会の緊急特別会合の開催を提案し、安全保障理事会での採決の結果、賛成多数で開催されることが決まりました。緊急特別会合は28日から始まり、アメリカとしてはロシアを非難する決議案を採決し、圧力を強めたい考えです。
ロシアによるウクライナへの軍事侵攻で市民を含め多くの死傷者が出る中、世界各地で抗議活動が行われています。
このうちロシアの首都モスクワでは、政権批判を続けた野党の指導者が殺害されてちょうど7年になる27日、多くの市民が献花に訪れ、抗議の意思を静かに表していました。軍事侵攻を批判する人も多く、ウクライナの国旗の色と同じ青色と黄色の花を手向けたりする人の姿もありました。一方、東京の JR 渋谷駅前では、日本に住むウクライナやロシアの人たちなどが参加する抗議集会が開かれました。集まった人たちは、プーチンを止めろと書かれたプラカードを掲げたりしながら、戦争反対などと声を上げていました。参加したウクライナ人の女性です。
私の友達家族今みんなウクライナにいます。そしてみんなすごく不安ですね。爆発を止めてほしいです。そのすべての戦争の行動を止めてほしいです。
ロシアで生まれ育ち、日本国籍を取得した男性は、
自分の国が起こした、痛みと苦しみは、許すことはできません。
自分の国であってもという。
だからこそっていう感じですね。
ガソリンなどエネルギー価格の上昇で家計の負担が年間で2万円余り増えるという試算がまとまりました。ウクライナ情勢などを反映してエネルギー価格は上昇が続いていて、家計の負担はさらに大きくなる恐れもあります。
内閣府は去年11月時点でのガソリンや灯油などエネルギー価格とおととしの平均価格との比較をもとに、家計の負担が年間でどの程度増えるかを世帯の年収別に5つのグループに分けて試算しました。その結果、最も低い平均年収255万円のグループで年間21,190円の負担増。最も高い平均年収1,217万円のグループでは年間29,461円の負担増となりました。増加額が収入に占める割合を見ると、年収が最も高いグループでは 0.24% だったのに対して、最も低いグループでは 0.83% と 年収が低いほど相対的な負担が大きくなりました。ウクライナ情勢を受けて全国のレギュラーガソリンの平均価格が去年11月に比べて3円余り値上がりするなど、エネルギー価格は上昇が続いていて、家計の負担はさらに大きくなる恐れもあります。
そしてこちらは値上げのニュースです。小麦粉や食用油など原材料価格の高騰を受け、食品メーカーの間では即席麺を値上げする動きが相次いでいます。
食品メーカーの間では、東洋水産がマルちゃんブランドの即席麺およそ220品目について値上げします。このうち希望小売価格が定められているものは 9% から 12% 引き上げるということです。小麦粉や食用油など原材料価格の高騰に加え、物流コストや燃料の価格なども上昇していることが理由です。また、山陽食品が袋麺の札幌一番など47品目の即席麺について、希望小売価格があるものはおよそ 10% から 12% 引き上げるほか、明星食品がチャルメラなどおよそ90品目の即席麺などについて 6% から 12% 引き上げます。いずれも今年6月の出荷分からになります。さらに、最大手の日清食品もカップヌードルなどの値上げを発表していて、即席麺の値上げの動きが相次いでいます。
世界の穀物価格はコロナ禍でのコンテナ不足や主な産地の天候不良などで上昇していますが、農業大国のウクライナにロシアが侵攻し、情勢が緊迫化する中で、農業生産に影響が出れば、世界の穀物価格が一段と上昇する可能性があり、身近な食品のさらなる値上げにつながらないか懸念されます。北朝鮮の朝鮮労働党機関紙労働新聞は、国家宇宙開発局と国防科学院が昨日、偵察衛星の開発のための重要な実験を行ったと今朝伝えました。
韓国軍は北朝鮮が昨日午前、首都平壌郊外の国際空港があるスナン付近から日本海に向けて弾道ミサイル1発を発射したと明らかにしていて、発表はこのミサイルを指すとみられます。労働新聞によりますと、実験では偵察衛星に搭載する撮影機器の特性や動作、正確性を確認したとしていて、紙面には宇宙空間から地球を撮影したとみられる写真2枚を掲載しています。北朝鮮は去年1月に打ち出した国防5カ年計画に軍事偵察衛星の開発を盛り込んでいて、新たな宇宙開発5カ年計画が去年から始まっていることを明らかにしていました。
まもなく7時14分になるところ。続いて、スポーツ。
担当は西川純一アナウンサーです。
はい、お伝えします。この時間は開幕まであと4日に迫った北京パラリンピックから、大会では6競技78種目が行われます。日本は29人の代表選手で臨みます。注目の選手をご紹介しましょう。まず、アルペンスキーでは選手団の主将を務める村岡桃佳選手。前回のピョンチャン大会では大回転で金メダルに輝くなど、出場した5種目すべてでメダルを獲得しました。去年の夏には車椅子陸上で東京パラリンピックにも出場。それから半年後の北京大会で2大会連続の金メダル獲得を目指します。クロスカントリースキーでは41歳の新田佳浩選手。これまで6大会で3つの金メダルを獲得し、今大会を集大成と位置づけています。その新田選手に憧れ背中を追い続けてきたのが21歳の川除大輝選手です。2019年の世界選手権では金メダルを獲得し、次世代のエースとして期待されています。そして、スノーボードチームでキャプテンを務める小栗大地選手。2大会連続出場で悲願のメダル獲得に挑みます。その日本選手たちが昨日初めて競技会場で練習を行いました。このうち 村岡桃佳選手などアルペンスキーの代表選手たちは、北京から北西75キロほどにある延慶の競技会場、国家アルペンスキーセンターで練習に臨みました。村岡選手は同じ座って滑るクラスで、これまでに銀メダル4つと銅メダル1つを取っている41歳のベテラン、森井大輝選手などと一緒に雪質などを確認した様子でした。また、クロスカントリースキーとバイアスロンに出場するノルディックチームの日本代表選手4人は、北京に隣接する河北省の張家口の競技会場、国家バイアスロンセンターで練習を行いました。このうち、クロスカントリースキー視覚障害のクラスで、冬のパラリンピックに初出場の有安良平選手は、去年夏の東京パラリンピックにもボートで出場した二刀流の選手です。有安選手は前を滑って誘導するガイドの藤田雄平さんとともに、コースの雪質や傾斜などを確認し、距離感や掛け声のタイミングを繰り返しチェックしていました。パラリンピックでの日本選手の活躍が期待される中、先に開かれた北京オリンピックで2つのメダルに輝いたスキージャンプ男子の小林陵侑選手が引き続き好調です。ワールドカップ個人の第22戦が27日フィンランドで開かれ、1回目で5位につけた小林選手は、2回目にこれ以上飛ぶと危険とされるヒルサイズを超える130メートル50をマークし、合計ポイント 278.0 で、ノルウェーのハルボール・エグネル・グランネルー選手と並び、共に優勝となりました。小林選手は今シーズン8勝目で、自らが持つ日本男子の最多勝利数を通算27勝に伸ばしました。これで小林選手はワールドカップの総合トップに立ちました。一方、27日にオーストリアで開かれた女子のワールドカップ個人では、日本のエース高梨沙羅選手がコンディション調整で欠場した中、伊藤有希選手が日本勢トップの10位に入りました。スポーツでした。
では続いて気象情報です。伊藤美幸さんお願いします。
はい。金曜日、土曜日と遅れていた季節の歩みを挽回するかのように気温が高くなりました。でも土曜日の夜から日本海側を中心に降った雨で、日曜日は冬型の気圧配置、少し季節が足踏みというところもありました。ただ今回の冬型では強い寒気の南下はなく、今日はまた晴れて気温が上がりそうです。寒かった2月、3月中旬から下旬並みの暖かさで締めくくるところが多くなりそうです。沖縄・奄美は晴れ、ところによって昼過ぎまで時々曇り、九州南部と四国は晴れ、九州北部、中国、近畿地方は晴れ、昼過ぎから時々曇り、東海は晴れ、関東甲信地方は晴れ、夜曇り、北陸は晴れ、時々曇り、新潟県と東北の日本海側、朝のうちを中心に午前中は雪や雨の降るところがありますが、ほとんどの地域は日中曇り空、晴れ間の出るところもあるでしょう。東北の太平洋側は晴れ時々曇り、内陸部で朝のうちところによって雪か雨。北海道も晴れ時々曇りで、朝のうちところにより雪。降る量は少ないですが、風が強く吹雪になるところもありそうです。予想最高気温は、那覇23度、鹿児島18度、福岡15度、高知16度、広島14度、松江15度、大阪14度、名古屋15度、金沢12度、新潟長野は10度、東京は15度、仙台12度、秋田7度、札幌釧路は2度の予想です。暖かさを待ってたいという方も多いかと思いますが、今日も雪解けが進みます。積もった雪が崩れやすくなりますので、雪崩や落雪にはご注意ください。また積もった雪重たくなっていますので、除雪作業中の事故や怪我にもご注意ください。関東から西の地域はスギ花粉にご注意ください。やや多いという地域も増えてきていて、四国や九州南部では多い、九州北部では非常に多く飛ぶ予想です。明日3月1日は南北に連なった前線が日本付近を通過するため、西から雨、また雨で雪解けも進むところがありそうです。ご注意ください。
暖かくなってきましたね。7時20分になります。近くの放送局から続けます。
Breaking just a few minutes ago, the European Union announcing it will purchase and deliver weapons to Ukraine, a first for the EU. All European Union countries also banning Russian planes from EU airspace. Let's bring in senior investigative reporter Aaron Katursky in Western Ukraine, along with senior Washington correspondent Devin Dwyer, who's here with us in our nation's capital. Aaron, let's begin with you. Ukraine saying missiles hit actually a radioactive waste disposal facility in Kyiv overnight. What danger does that now pose to those who are still in the city?
Well, thankfully, there was no apparent damage or any evidence of a radioactive leak. This is the kind of facility that helps with disposal of radioactive material from hospitals and the like. So it's low-level stuff, but it's an example, Kira, of the kind of collateral damage that can happen. And it's not the only bit of civilian infrastructure that's been hit so far in these early days of the fighting, as this fighting goes on multiple fronts, mainly in the capital, Kyiv. That's the centerpiece of the Russian invasion. But there's also been heavy fighting in Kharkiv, out into the east. In both places, though, the Ukrainian military says the defense is holding. And that's thanks in large part not only to the Ukrainian military, which President Zelensky has been trying to constantly rally, but also to a group of citizen soldiers who've been called to the fight. And I wanted to show you, Kira, if I could, the officials here in Ukraine have been posting instructions on how to make Molotov cocktails, and citizens are taking them up on the offer. And the most popular brewer in Lviv, Pravda Brewing, is no longer filling these bottles with beer, but giving them out empty so people can put gasoline and stuff a dish rag at the top to make a Molotov cocktail. This particular bottle has a rather unflattering picture of Vladimir Putin and an equally unflattering caption. But they are taking this very seriously, and citizens are learning to make Molotov cocktails and stockpiling them in ditches along the side of the road should there be any need if the Russian army should advance here.
So, Aaron, what does that tell you about just how Ukrainians are responding and preparing? I mean, we talk about the refugee crisis and so many people leaving. At the same time, clearly, there are Ukrainians wanting to stay and protect their homeland.
We've heard that hubris, that they are not going to go down without a fight. But there's also a sadness behind it, Kira, because they just say they want to live. If you look at Kyiv or any Ukrainian city, this was a modern capital a week ago, where people were outside, sipping coffee or on their laptops doing work, as you'd see anywhere in the United States or around the world. And almost instantaneously, it has been turned onto a war footing. And that involves the troops, but it also involves people that we see on the streets just tracking luggage. And we were at Lviv's main train station today. It's a real place of refuge for people that are fleeing more dangerous parts of the country and trying to head for one of the international borders, as almost 400,000 Ukrainians have already done, according to the United Nations. People are waiting hours and hours on the platform in the main hall. Kids are just propped on luggage, fiddling with a Rubik's Cube, babies in mothers' arms as people try to flee for safer ground.
And at the same time, what to make of Putin's latest comment of Devin on high alert, responding with these threats of using nuclear weapons. How is the White House responding to this?
Yeah, Kira, Russia has the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world, more than 6,000 of them, 1,600 of them actively deployed. So certainly a concerning threat by President Putin. The White House at this hour doesn't seem particularly alarmed. We heard from White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki. She said this is part of a pattern from Vladimir Putin, manufacturing threats to justify his aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere. She insisted there's at no point been a direct threat from NATO, much less Ukraine, towards Russia or its people. That's a sentiment that's been echoed just a few minutes ago by the Pentagon. Kira, as you said, they have called this move, this announcement by Vladimir Putin, escalatory and unnecessary. There is real concern, though, that this threat by President Putin could, risk a miscalculation. in some way by putting these forces on higher alert. So certainly watching that very closely, although I should say Kira asked directly if the United States has changed its nuclear strategic defense posture. An official would only say that the Pentagon is very confident in our posture at this stage, but no question that this has injected a new sense of worry and concern as this continues to evolve.
And Devin, Secretary of State Antony Blinken also saying the United States will provide $54 million now in humanitarian aid to help Ukrainians. What exactly will that money go toward?
Yeah, the United States is the biggest donor of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Hundreds of millions of dollars already given, $54 million announced overnight. This is to address that humanitarian crisis you talked about earlier. 368,000 so far, according to the UN, fleeing for the borders. Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, tweeted a short time ago a picture of some of that aid arriving. 23,000 high thermal blankets. It's cold over there. Aaron can tell you that. It's damp, it's chilly, people waiting in line for hours outside on both sides of the border. And also this, take a look, 640 satellite phones to help maintain communications on the ground. That has been seen as critical to the Ukrainians. A lot of their officials have asked for this as the Ukrainian military jams communications, launches those cyber attacks on the internet. Having sat phones on the ground could be a critical help to them as they communicate with the West and with their allies. Kira.
All right, Aaron Katursky and Devin Dwyer, gentlemen, thank you so much. Senior investigative reporter Aaron Katursky in Ukraine, along with White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks for more on what's happening at this hour. Aaron, Ukrainian President Zelensky agreeing to send a delegation now to meet with Russian negotiators at the Belarus border, but he says he doubts there will be a diplomatic breakthrough. What more can you tell us at this point?
Well, I wonder if it's because of what you mentioned, that Vladimir Putin has been rattling the saber and putting his nuclear assets on higher alert. In that context, can there really be diplomacy? We're not sure, but Zelensky said a short while ago that he didn't want to be accused of not doing everything he can as the president of the country to try to stop the war. So he has agreed to send a delegation to the border with Belarus. The initial proposal was to have the talks in Minsk, but Zelensky said that would have been impossible because Belarus he views as an aggressor since it hosted Russian troops and since he says missiles have been fired from Belarus toward the capital of Kyiv. And indeed, we got word of one not long ago by one of the airports on the outskirts of Kyiv. So that the hope for a breakthrough, at least on the Ukrainian side of things, doesn't seem to be very good.
So, Mary Alice, let me take it to you then. How seriously is the administration taking this escalation, and what's going on behind the scenes when it comes to Putin and these nuclear threats?
Yeah, Kira, I think anytime you're talking about nuclear weapons, of course, people listen and they are taking it very seriously. The White House press secretary was on ABC's This Week this morning, though, and she said this looked like a pattern of behavior from Russian President Vladimir Putin that he has repeatedly during this crisis. These are her words now. I lost my notes, tried to manufacture threats that don't exist to justify further aggression. We also got some word from a U.S. defense official that said that any talk like this could potentially be putting in play more forces where there could be a miscalculation. That's the concern, is that if you put people in a high alert like this, you have room for error, and that could, of course, make things much more dangerous.
So, Aaron, a senior U.S. defense official is saying now that Russia's advance has been slowed by stiff resistance from Ukrainian forces. Is that what you're seeing and hearing?
At least so far, although the mayor of Kyiv not long ago conceded that the city remains surrounded by Russian troops. There's still about 30 kilometers or so, it's estimated, from the center of the city. The advance has been slowed, it's thought, by two factors. One, the sheer ferocity of the Ukrainian defense, which includes the military and all of these civilian soldiers that have been mobilized in the last couple of days. And the U.S. and the British also think that the Russians have been hampered by a lack of fuel and other logistical problems, not only in Kyiv, but mainly in Kharkiv, where there was an intense fight in the streets. And the Ukrainians said they've been able to maintain control of that eastern city, the country's second largest. The worry, though, Western defense officials say, is that the Russians can always learn from these mistakes, resupply, reinforce the troops. They've only unleashed about 2/3 of their combat power. They still have 1/3 in weight, and as one U.S. defense official put it, they have a lot of assets at their beck and call.
And Mary Ellis, let's talk about what we mentioned up top, this developing news about energy giant BP saying it's pulling now nearly 20% of its stake out of the key Russian state oil company, Rosneft. Does the White House know if it expects any similar type of major moves from other American companies?
Yeah, we haven't heard that yet. We've pressed the White House on this. They actually referred us back to other companies. I think they wouldn't be surprised. We've seen a real piling on in the last few days. U.S. governors in New Hampshire, Ohio, Utah taking their own stance. Things like pulling Russian vodka from the shelves. I think there's increasing political and economic pressure right now. Obviously, that move from BP that you're mentioning is huge with unbelievable economic repercussions for the oil industry. But I think right now we're at this moment where not only politicians, but CEOs and board members are feeling like it is not viable to be doing business with the Russian government or major Russian entities.
All right, Mary Alice Parks, Aaron Katersky, thank you both so much. As Russia's military continues to strike Ukrainian cities, national security officials are keeping eyes on a different battlefield. Senior U.S. law enforcement and Homeland Security officials have told ABC News that there is growing concern that Russia could launch further cyber attacks against the West, potentially targeting electrical grids, banking systems, and mobile networks. That's why we want to bring in Ole Derivianko, a Ukrainian cybersecurity expert and co-founder of the leading Ukrainian cybersecurity company, Information Systems Security Partners. Let's talk to Ole about more. Ole, this is nothing new to you. You were talking about the threat of cyber attacks back in 2017 when Russian hackers took control of Ukraine's power grid. You were a canary in the coal mine then. Did anyone listen to you? Because there is a history here.
Kira, thanks a lot. It's a great question. And with cyber attacks, everyone gets kind of very agitated when cyber attack happens, when it culminates. But then the wave, comes down, and then people start thinking, oh, maybe it was the last one, And if people don't see the cyber attacks up above, kind of in the media for a while, they think that probably things came down. But cyber warfare is going on for years now, and there's no sign that's going to end. So for us, it's basically nothing new what's going on in terms of cyber. So and frankly, the level of cyber attacks at this particular moment in Ukraine, I mean, it's quite high, but it's typical. It was always like this.
So then let me ask you, what can you tell us about any initiatives being used right now to interrupt Russia's internal and/or military command and control communications?
Well, I mean, I cannot comment too much on military cyber efforts because basically the war is going on, and obviously I can't comment on this anything. But I can tell you that apart from what's going on in terms of professional cyber warfare, there's also there's a huge movement among the professionals in both IT and cyber in Ukraine who join different teams and different units, and they are not only helping companies and helping the military forces to do their job, to protect assets and keep protecting assets from both cyber attacks and other threats. But they also think about different perspectives. The cyber kind of units, cyber forces are thinking a little bit further ahead, and they're thinking about what we're going to do when we will win, and we will need to chase all the criminals, all the war criminals that conduct those crimes today, and that's why Ukraine already has all database of all the participants in this war here. So we're going to work further on that, and I think that everyone will have to be punished for what they did here.
Well, look, you understand and you know hacking, and there has been reports of progress to hack and shut down Russian comms so that this propaganda war can get crushed and the truth can get out to the Russian people on what is really happening. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing that working at this point?
Yeah, there's a lot of efforts to convene the truth and to send the message and to actually provide the accurate information of what's going on. And by the way, it relates not only to Russia, it also relates to Belarus, because obviously Belarus is also, at least at the level of government of Belarus, is helping Russia in this war. So actually participates in this war. So that's why we need also but look, you had in your program now very important pictures of what's going on now in even in Russia, let alone what's going on everywhere else in terms of how people rising up and how people actually kind of trying to finally realize what's going on. And of course, the majority of people in Russia are still, I believe, in the denial stage.
But the government of Ukraine is asking for help now from volunteers from the country's hacker underground. The message is put out there. What's the bigger threat here, you think? Troops on the ground or misinformation and cyber attacks?
No, of course, troops on the ground are a larger threat, of course, because it threatens directly the lives of people, and I mean, like not the military people, but everyone. So, but the informational component of this war is extremely important from various perspectives. From the perspective of keeping up the motivation and the mood of Ukrainians to fight. And also from the perspective of finally letting those folks in Russia and Belarus to realize what's going on and to stand up and overthrow their governments.
And of course, the other headline today, Elon Musk providing Starlink access to Ukraine. It's having an impact on operations to help avoid those Russian cyber attacks. We're going to follow those efforts as well. Ole Derivianko, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
As residents in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, are now being urged to stay indoors as Russian light armored vehicles have actually managed to enter the city. ABC News contributor General Robert Abrams, former commander of U.S. forces in Korea, along with Lieutenant General Doug Lute, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, join me now to discuss the latest tactics and strategies here. And just for a moment, gentlemen, I've seen so many articles circulating as of this morning, political leaders, military leaders speaking out about the mental state of Vladimir Putin. We'll get to what's taking place on the streets in just a moment, but if I could just get both of you to react, and General Lute, I'll start with you. I was looking at Marco Rubio. He was tweeting, I wish I could share more, but for now I can say it's pretty obvious to many that something is off with Putin. He's always been a killer, but his problem now is different and significant. It would be a mistake to assume this Putin would react the same way he would have 5 years ago. And at the same time, Michael McFaul, who is Obama's ambassador to Russia, he's been paying attention as well. He tweeted, I've watched and listened to Putin for more than 30 years. He's changed. He sounds completely disconnected from reality. He sounds unhinged. As military generals, I want to get your reaction. General Lute, first to you.
Well, first of all, I'll pass on this opportunity to express myself as an amateur psychiatrist. All right. What bothers me is his decision-making style and the decision-making arrangement that he's crafted over these years, a very autocratic rule, places him alone in the decision tree, isolates him from dissenting views, and actually suppresses dissenting views, as we saw very publicly in his so-called National Security Council session last week. So it's his isolation and the absence of dissent that really concerns me.
General Abrams, what do you think? Is Putin losing his mind here?
Well, I would align myself with former Ambassador Lute. Difficult to make some sort of medical diagnosis from this far a distance. But look, we have long considered Vladimir Putin as ruthless as he is, right? That he has been a rational actor. What we've seen over the last couple of weeks is really irrational behavior. And that is something that should be very concerning to everyone. When he becomes and develops a pattern of irrational behavior. And there's a clear distinction between what's acceptable norms and being a rational or irrational actor. And so I think that, as Ambassador Lute just said, he has sequestered himself. This has been a long pattern as reported throughout the COVID pandemic. And it's a very autocratic setup that he has, and no one will challenge him. That's the other problem. So it's a poisonous mixture that Putin has created for himself, and hopefully these negotiations will bear some fruit that maybe we can get him to off-ramp.
Well, poisonous mixture. Doug, I have to ask you, how do you expect NATO to react now to Putin's latest nuclear threat here? And if Putin actually orders a nuclear strike, what do you think the response would be?
Well, I think the nuclear deterrent, which is founded not as much on NATO, although NATO has some nuclear capability, but mostly on the strategic nuclear deterrent capability of the United States. This will be watched very carefully. And I think what's probably happening inside the Pentagon today and inside U.S. Strategic Command, which has control of our nuclear forces, is a very careful look at the difference between what Putin says, his rhetoric, as we saw today, right, his declaratory statements, and what actually happens on the ground. So do we see some change of status in nuclear warheads? Are they moved from one position to another? What about the delivery systems? Do we see nuclear-capable submarines put out to sea, out of port and to sea? What about nuclear-capable aircraft? Do their alert statuses actually change? Are there changes in the command and control system that we detect? So these will all be things that we're going to be watching very carefully. I think in the meantime, we should rest assured that our nuclear deterrent is in place, it's ready, and it's under appropriate civilian control.
So, General Abrams, Russian forces appear to be a bit disoriented as Ukrainians battle back. A U.S. official actually said that one Russian soldier was heard on this chilling radio call saying, "We don't know who to shoot. They all look like us." Why are these battles so difficult to tell which side is which at this point? And what do you make of that radio call?
Well, I think the easiest explanation for that radio call and what we're seeing in general from the Russian forces is a result of poor training over many, many years. Despite all their investments in modernization and so forth, there is no substitute for tough, hard, realistic training with feedback mechanisms and so forth. And the Russian military has never adopted that approach. That's principally seen as a Western approach, and a very successful approach, I might add. So we're seeing the results of a lack of training. Secondly, we're seeing the results of a very poorly designed operational plan and a complete lack of synchronization, as it appears, across all of Ukraine. Maybe some pockets of some synchronization, but tactically and operationally, this operation is completely desynchronized for a number of factors. And so, you know, it shouldn't surprise us that young Russian soldiers are completely flabbergasted, and they are unsure what to do. And it is very difficult. The uniforms do look strikingly similar. But as many reports have said, some of these Russians don't even realize that they were sent into Ukraine. So I think it's a combination of many factors that's all adding to sort of gumming up the gears of the Russian military as they try to achieve their objectives.
General Abrams, also Lieutenant General Doug Lute, appreciate you both. Thank you so much.
The escalating battle in Ukraine, fighting now breaking out in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv after Russian forces moved in. This following the ongoing bombardment of Kyiv and video capturing a fire at an oil depot outside the city near an airbase.
New images now of fighting across the country, crews sifting through rubble looking for survivors. This morning, media groups in Ukraine are now all banding together to broadcast in a single newscast. You see them there in an underground parking garage. They're providing uninterrupted coverage and combating any misinformation from Russian state media.
In Russia, President Putin praised his troops for carrying out the invasion to protect their country and its national interests. Our team is on the ground in the region, covering the crisis from all the angles. Let's get the latest now on the ground in the Ukrainian capital. ABC's Ian Pannell joins us now live from Kyiv. Good morning to you, Ian.
Yeah, good morning, Eva. Morning, guys. This is a city, a country on almost total war footing now. There's been a 39-hour curfew in place. That's overnight, throughout the day today and into Monday morning. There is nothing out on the streets, almost no noise apart from the sound of battle. But there's real anticipation here in Kiev about what's to come. But in Kharkiv, the country's second largest city, the Russians have launched what looks like an all-out offensive.
This morning, intense battles reported in Ukraine's second-largest city, Kharkiv, as Russian forces enter the city. But Ukrainian troops mounting what appears to be a strong defence. Heavy overnight bombardment was followed by what the Ukrainian Defence Ministry says is 2 armed units pushing into Kharkiv today. One appears to have been disabled amid social media videos of street fighting. At least 240 civilian casualties have been reported, including 64 dead, although the true number is likely higher. The Russian attacks also focusing on key infrastructure. We filmed a massive fire burning south of Kyiv, lighting up the night sky after an oil refinery was struck. Although Russian forces are more powerful, Ukrainian troops and civilians are putting up a stiff fight. A senior defense official telling ABC that Putin's troops have run into more resistance than anticipated. But the Kremlin this morning claiming more than 400 Ukrainian service members have surrendered. The country's President Zelensky refusing to leave the capital, rallying his countrymen, saying, "We will keep fighting, and if babies come into this world even under shelling and fire, then the enemy has no chance in this war." He was referring to this, a baby born in the basement of a hospital in a city under siege. The mayor of Kyiv and his brother Vladimir Klitschko are former world heavyweight boxing champions. They're rallying the city and appealing to the world.
Stop this war that Russia has started.
US officials saying that more than 50% of the 150,000 Russian troops amassed outside of Ukraine are now inside the country. In Kyiv, the military and civilian volunteers lining up to receive weapons, ready to dig in and fight to protect the capital.
We want to make sure that the world knows that Russia's main target is right now to take the city.
Under curfew and the threat of bombardment at any time, Ukraine 24 anchors moving their reporting to a parking garage. All major news networks now working together. And for many trapped in Kyiv, life has moved underground. Whole families finding shelter in underground metro stations. This is now a nationwide effort. Alina Mishkor is baking bread for the troops. She spoke to us from inside her darkened home, leaving the lights off for safety.
If we are attacked from air, we actually have no shelter because we live in the private house and it's very old. It wouldn't stand the shots.
Well, the Kremlin saying that it sent a negotiating team to Minsk, the Belarusian capital. President Zelensky saying he won't be sending a team, not least because Belarus is now a party to this conflict, suggesting instead that they meet in a neutral country. I think many analysts are now thinking that the Russian advance may not have gone as fast or as easy as Putin imagined, but it's worth emphasising this is still early days with reports that more forces and armaments are heading this way. Eva?
And Ian, on that note, Germany now changing their policy about sending weapons into conflict zones, saying they will help Ukraine. How does this help Ukraine's defense?
Yeah, I mean, Eva, this is huge. I mean, this has been a long-standing policy by Germany not to send offensive weapons into active conflict areas, and it shows how far Germany has shifted. It's not the only one. It's sending 500 Stinger missiles. These are surface-to-air missiles capable of taking out helicopters, certainly trying to balance the equation with these overwhelmingly powerful Russian forces. America are also sending weapons to Czech Republic and Poland. The question is that too little and is it too late? Eva?
Yeah, we'll have to watch and see. Ian Pannell for us there in Ukraine. ABC News contributor Colonel Steve Ganyard, a former Defense and State Department official. He joins us now from Washington. Good morning to you, Steve. I want to start with kind of what we were seeing overnight. It appears that Russia was really focusing not on Kyiv, but the fight overnight seemed to be much more in Kharkiv. Why do you think that is?
Well, part of it, Eva, is that Kharkiv is very close to the Russian border, so it's much easier for the Russians to resupply going into Kharkiv. It's still a big city, about 1.4 million. But I think there's a really interesting phenomenon going on here. We've been talking all week about the role of social media. Social media is keeping Mr. Putin honest. It is cutting down on the amount of disinformation that comes out of Moscow, and it's also almost a 24/7 look at the battlefield. That means that Mr. Putin cannot do what he would normally do, where we've seen in, say, Chechnya and Grozny, and that is shell civilian areas. That has slowed down the advance of his military into the cities because they have no real support. It makes them very vulnerable to Ukrainian defenses. So social media is slowing down the Russians, and every hour, every day that the Ukrainians can slow things down is to their benefit. We know that these new sanctions on the SWIFT banking system, if the U.S. Sanctions the Russian central bank, that is going to have an immediate effect. It won't be like sanctions that will take weeks and months to have effect. There could be immediate effects on the Russian economy on Monday. And the effect of all this is that we now have the Russians negotiating where they will hold peace talks. That is a big deal. If we see the Russians agree to something other than Belarus, that is a very good sign that there's a possibility, or at least a ray of hope, that we can get some peace negotiations underway in the next few days.
Now, as the people of Ukraine wait for these negotiations to come to fruition or not, they are seeing these the shootings and the bombings and all of that happening. And we know Putin really wants to take Kyiv, the capital. So realistically, how long do you think the capital can hold out?
I think everybody's been fairly surprised at how well the Ukrainians have done. Again, the Russian tactics are quite bizarre. They're sending individual columns of troops without any dismounted infantry, and so they're being picked off. We see these columns that have been blown up by the Ukrainians. So the Russians have had their hands tied by not being able to shell the cities in the way that they would normally do so. And so I think it's really an amazing thing to see what's happening in the Ukrainian defenses and how well they've been able to defend this thus far.
Steve Ganyard, thank you so much for being with us this morning and for that.
The heightened security in our nation's capital ahead of President Biden's first State of the Union address on Tuesday. Local and federal authorities preparing for protesters and possible trucker convoys making their way to the city. ABC's Ike Ajachi in Washington with more. Ike, good morning.
Good morning, Whit. On Tuesday, President Biden is expected to make his first State of the Union address here in D.C. It's also around the time 3 separate trucker convoys are expected to arrive in the district. Now, many of those protesters are undertaking that 11-day cross-country trek from California to Washington, D.C. in order to protest several issues, ranging from COVID-19 vaccine mandates to domestic oil production. Now, the protesters have been telegraphing their intentions and moves for several days now. Some expected to stay in the D.C. metro area in time for Biden's address. Others will be looking to stay for some time afterwards. But most are threatening to stop the flow of traffic in the D.C. metro area, all while the president delivers his speech to a joint session of Congress. But the advance warning has given local and federal authorities time to plan. D.C.'s Metropolitan Police is ramping up resources ahead of the potential trucker protests with increased patrols through March 5th, as well as readying 2 rapid response teams that have the ability to deploy at a moment's notice. Also, the Pentagon approving a request from local D.C. government to deploy some 700 National Guard troops ahead of the convoy's arrival. Now, local officials here have been warning residents about the potential traffic disruptions, even issuing a push alert about those traffic issues. And they're asking residents to be patient and mindful, reminding them if you see something, say something. Whit?
All right, Ike, thank you. And tune in to ABC News on Tuesday for full live coverage of President Biden's State of the Union address and the Republican response.
Now to the latest moves from the White House. More U.S. weapons are on the way to Ukraine, including those surface-to-air missiles. The president raising the pressure on Moscow with more economic sanctions. And ABC's Mary Alice Parks is live for us in Wilmington, Delaware. Mary Alice, good morning.
Gia, good morning. Yeah, this was a big announcement last night. The U.S. and European partners going further than they had before, trying to isolate the Russian government from the rest of the world and hit those Russian elites where it hurts. A senior administration official telling reporters, quote, "We'll go after their yachts, their luxury apartments, their money, their ability to send their kids to fancy colleges in the West."
This morning, the U.S. and European partners looking to make the Kremlin pay a stiff price for its invasion on Ukraine, announcing another round of severe financial punishments designed to further sever ties between Russian banks and the rest of the world.
So at this point, we're talking about the most maximal type of sanctions that we can apply against a major economy that's integrated with not just the European economy, but the global economy. So these are significant.
The group of Western countries now moving to bar some Russian banks from the SWIFT system that facilitates foreign transactions. And they're also taking aim at the Russian central bank in a major move that could lock up over $600 billion the Russian government has in savings abroad. A senior U.S. administration official telling reporters that Russia's war chest of foreign reserves is, quote, only powerful if Putin can use it. The White House arguing the ruble will fall even further. And from the public to the very private, jets, yachts, and mansions in the U.S. and Europe owned by Russian elites now targets too. The White House promising a new task force to identify, hunt down, and freeze the assets of Russian companies and oligarchs who have already been sanctioned.
Now, this weekend, U.S. governors in New Hampshire, Ohio, Utah piling on, pulling Russian vodka from shelves. Now, so far, none of these economic penalties seem to have changed Putin's calculus, and it remains to be seen whether any of these new measures will make a difference either. But this morning, experts are commenting that these latest moves really do look like a leveling up from the West.
Yeah, many waiting to see what happens when the markets open tomorrow. Mary Alice Forrest, thank you.
Now to the growing refugee crisis. Tens of thousands of people trying to escape the violence, some waiting in 10-mile-long lines at the border. ABC's Matt Gutman joins us from the Ukrainian city of Lviv with the latest. Good morning to you, Matt.
Eva, good morning. We're at the train station in Lviv, and I just want to give you a sense of what we're seeing here. Look up and down this line. There are literally thousands of people on this platform. I'm going to show you this direction as well. All of them waiting for a train to Poland and hopefully to safety. Many of these people have been waiting here, they told me, for 24 hours. 150,000 people have already left Ukraine, and there are hundreds of thousands displaced internally.
As soon as we entered the border crossing, we saw them. A stream of older women, guards helping them across, mothers struggling with those strollers. And at the border, that crush against the gate. Guards on top ordering them back. Vehicles coming into Ukraine forced to cut through those crowds. The UN now estimating at least 150,000 refugees have fled Ukraine, and more are coming. Getting out, we walked through that crowd.
You can see that crush of people up against the fence. They're trying to squeeze through the narrowest of gaps, basically one person at a time, but mostly women and children. Tensions have been mounting there, and everywhere around you here, there are hundreds and hundreds of people waiting for their opportunity to go in.
There were many different nationalities, but all of them speaking the language of desperation.
Wow.
This woman begging me for help, showing me her American passport.
My family is in the United States. I'm coming this 3 weeks ago with my mom, very sick, and I come and visit her with my mom.
How many people do you think are in this circle? I mean,
volunteers trying to help organize those crowds.
So we're trying to organize the groups for 50 people, and then everybody queue up. And then we'll get group by group inside the gates so they can cross the border.
This girl sitting atop her father's shoulders, holding that teddy bear high. And next to them, we found this couple. Alex whispering his love to his wife, holding her face in his hands, then hugging his children with no idea when he'd see them again.
But you can't go.
I don't want to go.
You don't want to go. You want to stay here.
Of course.
To fight?
Yes.
His wife, Svetlana, telling me it's in his character to stay.
He loves Ukraine.
Yeah.
He loves his country.
Yeah, very much.
Tears in his eyes, Alex turned and walked off to war. We walked farther towards that impenetrable traffic. Multiple lanes turned into a parking lot. Thousands forced to just abandon their cars, grabbing as much as they could drag or roll, and walked as far as 14 miles to the border. Those traffic jams defying imagination. But we were unable to shake that image of that lone little girl in yellow, maybe like everyone else here, trying to fight back the tears.
Now, with fighting intensifying in Kyiv and in the east of the country, UN officials tell us that this is only going to intensify. That said, we've seen volunteers handing out food, offering to drive people anywhere they wanted to go. But having seen that border crossing with Poland and this train station, what is now obvious is that there is no easy way out. Gio.
Such a tough situation. Matt, thank you for that.
Now to Russia, where the effects of economic sanctions are already being felt, and some small anti-war protests have broken out with some demonstrators detained by police. ABC's James Longman joining us now from Moscow with more. James, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. The Kremlin is doing its best to hide the reality of this war from its own people, but that is only going to get harder as it continues. And actually, Vladimir Putin was on TV this morning thanking Russian troops for their duty in the Donbass, continuing to give the false impression that Russia has only moved into the east of Ukraine. And life is already changing for regular Russians because of sanctions. Since the ruble sank, $7 billion has already been withdrawn from the banks. Things like electronics are rocketing in price. Car parts are becoming unavailable. Travel very difficult. I myself actually have already started to find using my credit card here hard. My Apple Pay has stopped working, and businesses are asking more and more for cash as they're worried about their accounts. And a former Russian central bank official has said he thinks there'll be a catastrophe on the Russian currency market on Monday, tomorrow, when trading opens. People here share so much with their southern neighbors, and so state media makes virtually no mention of Kyiv. The narrative remains that this is simply a limited operation in eastern Ukraine. And as this is all as the crackdown on dissent here in Russia continues, one human rights monitor estimates that more than 3,000 people have now been arrested in anti-war protests here. The big question, will more people, as so many have already done, risk coming out into the streets in big numbers? We've seen more barricades going up around the Kremlin, so clearly the government here worries they might. Eva?
James Longman for us there in Russia.
We begin with that breaking news out of Ukraine and the Russian assault. The capital city of Kyiv now on lockdown, but still in Ukrainian control, despite the overwhelming might of the Russian army. One U.S. official tells ABC News some Russian forces are disoriented. One soldier heard saying, "We don't know who to shoot. They all look like us." Moments ago, our team on the ground in Kyiv witnessing a large explosion and massive fire south of the city. Earlier, ordinary Ukrainians lining up to receive weapons to fight as neighborhoods become war zones. This video showing the moment a rocket or missile strikes an apartment building, and this is the aftermath. Incredibly, no one was killed. It's not clear which side fired. But a U.S. official says Russian forces have launched more than 250 missiles into Ukraine. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians now refugees, creating a humanitarian crisis. Our teams there are capturing the emotional scenes at border crossings, fathers saying goodbye to their families, staying to fight. And moments ago, that breaking news of another economic blow to Putin's Russia, the U.S. and some of its allies agreeing to remove some Russian banking institutions from a key international financial system. We have team coverage on the ground, and our chief national correspondent, Matt Gutman, leads us off from Ukraine.
Tonight, the sounds of war ringing throughout Kyiv. The Russian military renewing its assault on Ukraine's capital, the city under strict curfew for the next 48 hours. That as skirmishes break out in the streets. The threat of Russian bombardment so present tonight that the news station Ukraine 24 is anchoring its coverage from an underground parking garage. According to a senior U.S. defense official, Vladimir Putin's forces are staging around 20 miles outside of Kyiv, so far unable to take the city. The official saying, "We don't believe that they expected the kind of resistance that they're facing." Ukraine's loyal sons and daughters defiant, civilians taking up arms, including this young couple, married just yesterday. Today, they are soldiers. Our Ian panel with volunteers.
We are happy that we can protect our country. Really, we feel our devotion and obligation to do that.
President Volodymyr Zelensky standing ready to fight with his countrymen. With this rallying cry, we withstood and are successfully repelling the enemy's attacks. The fighting goes on in many cities of our state, but we know we are defending our country, our land, and our children's futures. According to a U.S. official, the Russian military has launched more than 250 missiles into Ukraine. Social media video showing the moment a missile or rocket strikes this apartment building within Kyiv's city limits. It's unclear which side fired. Tatiana and her family were inside that building. She says, "My kid's room is now just a hole. If she'd been in there, she wouldn't have survived." Remarkably, no one was killed, but the human toll is growing. Nearly 200 Ukrainians have died in the conflict so far, over 1,000 wounded, including children. This unexploded rocket landing near a kindergarten in the middle of a playground. That as Ukraine's neighborhoods become battlefields. This family of 15 forced to flee their home after it was damaged by shelling. Young Anita asking her mother, "What if something happens tonight? Where will we go?" And now the global community standing in solidarity with Ukraine on top of those harsh sanctions. Germany now sending anti-tank weapons, and the U.S. announcing an additional $350 million in military aid, including, critically, Stingers, those shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles. President Biden today saying Putin will pay a serious price for this short-term and long-term.
You have two options. Start a third world war, go to war with Russia physically, or two, make sure that a country that acts so contrary to international law ends up paying a price for having done it.
That senior U.S. defense official saying more than 50% of the forces Russia arrayed on Ukraine's borders have now pushed into the country. But Ukraine's military is fighting back, claiming to have destroyed a Russian convoy on the road to Kyiv. And to the west, in Lviv, these men preparing Molotov cocktails to fend off the invading army. We crossed from Poland into Ukraine today at its busiest border crossing. Those cars entering, splitting that sea of humanity.
You can see this push of people that's starting to move towards the gate. They're actually trying to move people back before. There are hundreds and hundreds of people here. They're brandishing their documents. Some are showing that they are foreign citizens. Right now, only women and children are being allowed through that gate to Poland. You can't go.
I don't want to go.
You don't want to go. You want to stay here.
Of course.
To fight?
Yes.
And everywhere, desperation.
Those heart-wrenching scenes. Matt Gutman is with us from Lviv tonight. And Matt, that additional $350 million in military aid authorized by President Biden, how soon will that aid and those critical Stinger missiles actually reach Ukraine?
A U.S. official telling us tonight that should happen very soon. Obviously, there's some urgency here with Kyiv in such peril. Now, getting those Stinger missiles to the region is the easy part. Getting them into the fight is going to be a lot harder. The Ukrainian airspace is closed, and roads and railways are so jammed with refugees right now. Whit.
And the timing so critical. All right, Matt, thank you to you and your team.
And Russian forces are closing in on Kyiv with skirmishes dotting the outskirts of the Ukrainian capital. Some of the fighting suggests that smaller Russian units are attempting to carve a path for the larger main force, now standing less than 20 miles from the city's center. I want to bring in ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy and ABC News contributor, former deputy director of the Counterterrorism Center of the CIA, Darrell Blocker, for more on this. Mick, I'd like to start with you. A senior U.S. official told ABC News today that some Russian forces are disoriented and are realizing this is much harder than they thought, but also that every indication is Russians have given that the Russians gave about wanting to initiate diplomatic talks is just buying themselves time to resupply. So what do you think is working for the Russian military? What isn't working for them? And same question for the Ukrainian defense forces.
So I do think that it's very clear that we, the Western intelligence agencies, had this down to a T. We knew exactly what they were going to do. But the one factor the Russians didn't take into account was the tenacity and, quite frankly, the bravery that the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian population has exhibited in the face of this overwhelming enemy. It's unlikely, unfortunately, that it will stop the onslaught of the Russian invasion. They are dwarfed by the military capacity of the Russians, but I do think that's what caused this delay. As far as the diplomatic effort, I think it's now very clear that Russia has used diplomacy as a ruse in order to prepare for and eventually launch this assault. I do think we should keep diplomatic channels open. Anything to stop this level of violence against the civilian population is worth trying, but we have to be very hesitant in anything that the Russians have to say.
All right. And Daryl, Germany is providing 1,000 anti-tank weapons and 500 portable surface-to-air missiles to Ukraine. And this is a significant shift in Germany's position. So how important, one, is that shift, and two, are these weapons?
Well, the anti-tank missiles are essentially bazookas with a 80 to 120-foot range. So they will impact how the tanks are employed, which means it'll impact how the infantry coming after the tanks are employed. And whether it's in the hands of the Ukrainian military, militia, or even newly trained and newly formed militia groups, it's not very difficult to fire the anti-tank missiles. Now, on the surface-to-air missile front, the Russians know full well that if they can't control the airspace, they can't control the ground either. And 33 years ago this month, surface-to-air missiles were significant in pushing them out of Afghanistan.
So, Mick, what kinds of tactics do you think is the Ukrainian army employing to try to do their best to stand toe-to-toe with this much larger, better-trained Russian force?
Well, Daryl's exactly right. These weapon systems, these javelins, which are the anti-tank systems, these Stinger missiles, which are the anti-aircraft missiles, are an exponential factor on the battlefield. So the more we can get them these type of weapons, the more they can resist, not just the invasion, but also in what I think is for sure going to be one of the fiercest insurgencies we've ever seen when this invasion is over and the occupation takes place. So they have used these weapons to great effect. But it's not just the weapon system, right? It's the fight in the soldier. And I think we've seen great examples of how much these individuals are willing to fight, including one Marine, Ukrainian Marine, detonating a bridge with himself on it to stop the forward advance of Russian forces. It is that willingness to fight, plus the support that they can get from NATO and the United States, that will make a difference in this fight.
And Daryl, what options are open for nations who want to help Ukraine without putting actual troops within its borders?
Well, I would always recommend to them that reach out to any of the NATO nations, reach out to any of the EU nations, reach out to any of the Five Eyes nations, because they would probably already have had some semblance of these discussions in the past, but they also might not want to reach the ire of the Soviets or the Russians after the fact. So they can do it quietly through existing channels. And I hope they all do step up. And they have been. Post 9/11 was a perfect example of countries who might not have been aligned with the United States or with the EU or NATO that all of a sudden coalesced and fought a greater evil.
And Mick, Russia has claimed time and time again that they're only targeting military infrastructure, but we've seen video of Ukrainian bridges, even apartments, getting hit with missiles. So is this intentional or is it incompetence?
So that's exactly the question. Is it intentional or incompetence? Either one is really bad. I don't have a way to independently verify the videos that you are referencing, but I've seen them. And it includes a Russian tank rolling over a car full of civilians with civilians inside, as well as these strikes on these apartments. These are unacceptable, and the U.S. and the international community needs to hold Russia to account for these obvious, if they are in fact correct, war crimes.
And Daryl, the U.S. has given $350 million worth of lethal defensive aid to Ukraine. How important do you think that will be in this conflict?
$350 million of weapon systems doesn't always equate to a lot, but what it does is significantly prove to the people on the ground that we are there with them, that we'll be there to support them, and this is just the first of hopefully a nonstop tranche of weapons that are going to be coming their way for as long as it takes to push the Russians back to the other side of the border.
All right, Mick Mulroy, Daryl Blocker, we appreciate the analysis. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're looking at demonstrations outside the White House. Protesters are carrying banners reading "Putin is a Hitler, stop Putin now," and chanting USA support Ukraine as they call for more action against Russia. Meanwhile, a White House official says President Biden held a call with his national security team this morning on the latest developments in Ukraine. ABC News reporter Ike Ajochi is here with more on that. Ike, what do we know about this call between the president and his advisors?
Well, that's right. This was a scheduled call between Vice President Kamala Harris and the rest of President Biden's national security team. We know that call started shortly after 10 a.m. It's concluded by now, but we don't know how long that call lasted. However, there are two main things the Biden administration is dealing with right now in terms of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. The first one is punishing and deterring Russia for their aggressive actions toward Ukraine. And the other is providing support for Ukraine. President Biden announcing a new tranche of support in terms of $350 million to those frontline Ukrainian defenders. The story now is how will it be possible to get that aid to those Ukrainian fighters with the airspace surrounding that area heavily contested.
And so what are the next steps for the White House, Ike?
Well, the next steps are securing the aid for the Ukrainian defenders and obviously getting it to them. That's very difficult. Now, we know that aid, it will be anti-armor, body armor, actually, for those fighters, the frontline fighters. And we also know now that the United States will be providing Stinger missiles, those surface-to-air missiles that will really make it hard for Russia to control the airspace. But the problem now is getting it to them. We know now that Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said that right now it's going to be difficult. They're going to have to figure out new, novel ways to get it to them, since those dropping those off through the airspace just won't be possible right now. It's something that the national security team has been trying to figure out really all week. Nevertheless, it's something that we do know they will be very cognizant of and moving forward in terms of trying to figure out a way to properly arm those Ukrainian fighters so they can defend their country, defend their country's sovereignty, which is something which is heavily under attack right now by those Russian forces.
All right, Ike Ajochi, thanks for the update. We appreciate it.
Tonight, federal officials warning that hackers are targeting organizations in Ukraine, deploying destructive malware. The U.S. government also warning American companies to be vigilant and shore up their defenses. ABC's Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas with an exclusive look inside NSA efforts to combat potential cyber attacks.
With the Ukraine crisis escalating tonight, the threat of all-out cyber war perhaps has never been greater.
If Russia pursues cyber attacks against our companies, our critical infrastructure, we are prepared to respond.
The Kremlin has an army of hackers at its disposal.
We've seen from past Russian cyber attacks, or at least operations launched out of Russian soil, that they can have an impact on either critical infrastructure here or different industries.
But the U.S. has far-reaching capabilities of its own.
Welcome to Dreamport. This is one of two labs.
This is the Dreamport facility, developed by the U.S. Cyber Command, along with the private sector and partners in academia, to foster innovation in hacking defense and offense.
All of the devices that power this model city are real, actual devices that you would find out in the real world.
This miniature city used to practice real-world attacks.
This young hacker is about to take out power to an entire city.
Dreamport hackers turned off the city's lights, caused a water park to flood, disrupted traffic lights, and brought the city's port to a halt.
This is not science fiction. This is involving activities and maneuvers that hackers can actually do to disrupt our daily lives.
Absolutely. The future is now. We're not dealing in something that's 50 years away. The idea here is to model the behavior of disruptive cyber attacks against critical infrastructure, understand how they work, understand the resilience, how to defend against it. And again, you can't protect what you don't understand.
Homeland Security's bottom line, protecting against cyber attacks is no longer optional. It could be about the survival of your business. Whit?
All right, Pierre Thomas for us. Thank you.
And a look at Kyiv, a city in crisis amid Russian attacks.
Yeah, we are seeing Russia's invasion unfold in real time on our screens. From the news coverage to posts on social media, the information and images really can be anxiety-inducing, especially for kids.
Which brings us to our GMA cover story. Parenting expert Erica Suter is here to give us some tips on how to navigate those tough talks with your kids on this very difficult subject. Good morning to you, Erica.
Good morning, guys.
So, Erica, I want to start with, how do you even broach the topic of war with children?
Yeah, well, our natural inclination is to shield them from any scary or violent news. But the fact of the matter is, at school, on the playground, in class from older siblings, they're getting a lot of information. So the first thing parents need to do is find out what your kids know, because you don't want to overwhelm them with information. But also be prepared for the conversation. That means you need to do your homework, know about the situation, and know what you're going to say. And remember that a discussion with an 8-year-old is going to be totally different than a discussion with a 12-year-old.
No doubt about it. Erica, we know kids always have lots of questions. So how can you talk about a situation like this when you really don't have all the answers?
Right. Well, it's okay not to have all the answers, right? But you want to be able to correct any misinformation they have, especially if they're little. And you also want to reassure them that reassure them and comfort them. Let them know everything's going to be okay. Like, for example, if your child says, I'm really scared, there's a war, Mommy, what are we going to do? You want to tell them, you know what? There is a war. It's very scary. It's far away. You're going to be fine. Use simple language and use true facts, and that'll be very comforting to your kids.
What do you think is the best way to reassure them?
Well, it's really important for parents to be calm, right? If we're nervous, frantic, and anxious, our kids are more likely to be nervous, frantic, and anxious. So you're going to want to reassure them, tell them that they're going to be safe, and not to worry.
What are your tips for parents who are navigating through already difficult times?
Yeah, this is a really tough situation. We're all stressed. We're all a little worried, right? So the first thing you want to do when you go into a situation like this, have age-appropriate conversations with your children, give simple and comforting answers, but also, and this is really important, find ways for your family to de-stress together. Focus on fun for a little bit when you're not talking about current events or what's going on in the world. Just make sure that everyone knows that there's time that you can be together and relax and find comfort with one another.
Yeah, some good tips for us this morning. Erica Suter, thank you so much for being with us.
And a look at Kyiv, a city in crisis amid Russian attacks.
Yeah, we are seeing Russia's invasion unfold in real time on our screens. From the news coverage to posts on social media, the information and images really can be anxiety-inducing, especially for kids.
Which brings us to our GMA cover story. Parenting expert Erica Suter is here to give us some tips on how to navigate those tough talks with your kids on this very difficult subject. Good morning to you, Erica.
Good morning, guys.
So, Erica, I want to start with, how do you even broach the topic of war with children?
Yeah, well, our natural inclination is to shield them from any scary or violent news. But the fact of the matter is, at school, on the playground, in class from older siblings, they're getting a lot of information. So the first thing parents need to do is find out what your kids know, because you don't want to overwhelm them with information. But also be prepared for the conversation. That means you need to do your homework, know about the situation, and know what you're going to say. And remember that a discussion with an 8-year-old is going to be totally different than a discussion with a 12-year-old.
No doubt about it. Erica, we know kids always have lots of questions. So how can you talk about a situation like this when you really don't have all the answers?
Right. Well, it's okay not to have all the answers, right? But you want to be able to correct any misinformation they have, especially if they're little. And you also want to reassure them that reassure them and comfort them. Let them know everything's going to be okay. Like, for example, if your child says, I'm really scared, there's a war, Mommy, what are we going to do? You want to tell them, you know what? There is a war. It's very scary. It's far away. You're going to be fine. Use simple language and use true facts, and that'll be very comforting to your kids.
What do you think is the best way to reassure them?
Well, it's really important for parents to be calm, right? If we're nervous, frantic, and anxious, our kids are more likely to be nervous, frantic, and anxious. So you're going to want to reassure them, tell them that they're going to be safe, and not to worry.
What are your tips for parents who are navigating through already difficult times?
Yeah, this is a really tough situation. We're all stressed. We're all a little worried, right? So the first thing you want to do when you go into a situation like this, have age-appropriate conversations with your children, give simple and comforting answers, but also, and this is really important, find ways for your family to de-stress together. Focus on fun for a little bit when you're not talking about current events or what's going on in the world. Just make sure that everyone knows that there's time that you can be together and relax and find comfort with one another.
Yeah, some good tips for us this morning. Erica Suter, thank you so much for being with us.